Hello again, Steve here. I just wanted to say a few words in relation to these two words, explicit and implicit, with regards to so-called law, right? So explicit, obviously, this is something which is stated clearly with no room for confusion. That's explicit, right? If I hold an apple up, I say this is an apple. It consists of a skin. You can see it, you can touch it. You can cut it open, you can see there's a core in there, and there's the fleshy part of the apple. It's got a certain consistency, and so on. There's no room for confusion as to that thing existing or not. Implicit, on the other hand, is something that is implied, though not plainly expressed. So, the foundation of law, government law, what we call government law, is basically explicit in nature, or rather, let me repeat, implicit in nature as I see it. And here's why. If, say for example, you get stopped for not wearing a seatbelt, and there's a ticket issued, okay, the foundation of that expression of the cop telling you have to wear it, and because you're not wearing it, here's a penalty. The foundation of that is based upon you being subject to that so-called law. Now, if you were from, let's say, Namibia or someplace that had no agreement with so-called Canada, and you were brought into court under that circumstance, the judge would just have to declare there's no jurisdiction here. No jurisdiction. You just throw it out, right? And the reason is because, and I've got a little bit of first-hand knowledge of this because I was in front of a judge once, and I asked him quite clearly, this statute, which of course statute is a document of government law essentially, for a particular aspect of government, right? I asked him specifically, does this apply to an entity of government, this particular statute? And he said yes. So then I asked, if somebody, some person, is not part of government, or something is not part, has nothing to do with the government, would this apply? And he was a little bit confused with the question, but he was forced to say, well, of course not. So you can see that the basis of it is not the ticket, is not the not wearing it, is not wearing a seatbelt or anything else. The basis of it is that the law or the so-called regulations apply in the first place. Somebody who's a stateless person or is from a diplomatic immunity or the Queen or whatever, it doesn't apply, right? Because there's no foundation in place. It's like trying to put a house just hovering in the air with no foundation. It won't stay there. It won't hold up. It has no standing. I use the term standing. So it just has to get thrown out. Or if one is an idiot in the court's eyes. So that really is not doing any teaching here or anything, but it's something to think about in terms of questioning, because courts and so on, they claim at least to operate on evidence. So a good question is, in courts perhaps, but it'll get probably steamrolled, but at least we'd have some fun with it. What's the evidence that I am subject to that? Not denying I wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Clearly saw me not wearing a seatbelt. Guilty of the facts, no question about it. But the first question is, do you have any evidence that I'm actually subject to that? What is the evidence? And because these sort of so-called courts operate on presumption, they're just presuming that you are. Right? They're presuming that you are. They are implicit in their assertion. They're implying, but they're not plainly expressing it. But according to these procedures, supposedly procedures of law, when there's a question of evidence, there has to be answers, I would think. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. But nevertheless, most of that stuff gets ignored by these organizations these days. But at least it helps us in terms of our quality of life to realize what's actually going on and what we are, right? I was talking to somebody the other day, and I know it was a few weeks ago, and I was making the point that I am not a Canadian citizen. I may have a Canadian citizen, but I'm not a Canadian citizen. Why am I not a Canadian citizen? Because a Canadian citizen is something that human beings made up, right? There could be two versions of me, hypothetically, right? One version here and one version here, sitting side by side. How can you tell which one is the Canadian citizen? You can't, right? So you can't make the claim that you are a Canadian citizen. It's like whatever we create is not what we are. We can have it. Like I could build a birdhouse, but I don't say that I am the birdhouse. I could, if I was skilled enough, build a car or buy a car. I wouldn't say that that is me, the car. No, that's my car. So something like a Canadian citizen, a US citizen, British citizen, whatever, is just a legal status. A legal status, right? That you either have access to or not, based on some agreement. So that was my assertion. So that's also interesting in, or is important, I think, in terms of us learning about ourselves and self-knowledge, right? Is realizing what we are and being intellectually honest as to what we actually are. Strip away all those fantasies, all those fictions, all those creations that we have created, and come back to what created us, right? The nature that creates us. Well, what are we? Well, we're either man or woman, right? There's people today who will say they're somewhere in between or transgendered or whatever, but that doesn't really matter. I like to use the old terminology, just man, right? And it's not just me saying it. I had a woman tell me the other day that a woman is a man because it's a man, right? Man in terms of the general sense. And I don't even like anymore the word person so much for that, because that's a confusion. That's a confusion that gets used in the legal realm. A person is not equivalent to man. And also, even human being is another one of those things. Is why put the hue in front of it, right? Why not just man? And what's interesting in my searchings is legal beagles, they stay away from man. They don't mention man at all. I've never seen it written in any legal statute as being compelled to do anything, right? Because they know there's what creates us. There's men and women, and there's what men and women create. And what men and women create can never dominate over what creates it. But what we do as men and women is we descend into those things we create, and we tell ourselves that I am a Canadian citizen. Well, if that's what I am, then I am part of government, right? Because government is a body politic, right? It's like a politic being like an agreement among many, many people, right? That this is what we're part of. It's like a big family, right? If you say that you belong to the MacDonald clan, or whatever, well, that's an association, a framework, a connection, an association, and a sort of a national pride or whatever. Whereas, and the same thing with, and that's what nation was about. I mean, nation, the origins of the word is the same basis as far as I remember, as nature and natal and so on. It's sort of like the birth, where you're birthed from, right? The words get changed now to country, because country is not a nation, right? Country is like an empire, essentially, of many different nations. Whereas we have what we call now the First Nations. Each one of those groups is a tribe. They're all related. They're all a family, They're all biological family that can be traced for the most part. Whereas the biology of all the people in a place like Canada, very difficult to trace the lineage, so we don't say that they're actually a nation typically. So I use the word country. But I know I got off on a bit of a divergence here. The topic was explicit and implicit. I think it's important for us, for our honesty, to be as explicit as we can rather than implicit. Because implicit is what leads to assertions, unfounded assertions, presumptions, which are not fully built, and be able to call people on those presumptions, no matter who they are, right? It doesn't do any good to try to bring it up with cops and so on because they're not taught this. We get into, if you want to have fun with it, into the courts to challenge these little funny little goofy things. Asking the question, like, what is the basis of the presumption that I am what you say I am? There's an interesting old story, and I don't remember the details of it, but Jesus, when he was in his trial, the whoever it was, the magistrate or Pontius Pilate or whatever, was putting forward, don't you say you're the king of the Jews, and so on and so on. And he wouldn't admit to that. He would say, I think he finally said, it's you say it. What does that mean? It's not, I'm not saying it. You know, what else went on? He might have said, well, what's your evidence? That's an interesting thing to ask. I think it's kind of interesting. It's interesting to get the responses. In my short time of inquiring about these things, what I found, though, is there's just zero answers. Absolutely zero answers. And the reason is because it's implicit. There's an implication, but it's not plainly expressed. And why isn't it plainly expressed? Because there is nothing. You cannot be. Here's men and women, what men and women create. You cannot be what you create. You can have it. It can be your property. You can have a Canadian citizen, but you can't be a Canadian citizen. Canadian citizen is something that's made by man, right? Men and women. Men and women got together and said, let's create this document thing called a Canadian citizen. Well, you can't be that. You could have it, right? Just like you can create a car or a birdhouse or a cake. You can't be the car, the birdhouse, or the cake, but you can have the car, the birdhouse, or the cake. It's the same thing with the Canadian citizen. And the guy I was talking to this a few weeks ago, he wouldn't admit it. It was religious. It was a religious experience for him. It was like you asking somebody, well, do you got any evidence of God? I mean, seriously. And it's just too overwhelming. It's too overwhelming to go to on short notice for somebody. It just turns their world upside down. And it's like, all my life I've been living this bullshit. They don't want to admit that. And but that's interesting. You know, it's just interesting to be honest as possible, I think, if we want to know ourselves. Don't necessarily make a lot of friends, but it sure is interesting. It's a challenge. Anyways, it was great chatting again. Talk again soon.